everybody. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. This is Falcon Napier. Today we're going to continue our discussion on spiral dynamics and how it relates to the change grid and vice versa. In the first two calls we did on the subject, we explored the spiral dynamics levels, and we talked a bit about how it might overlay on the change grid. Last time around, we also said, well, why is it a spiral? And I think we were able to kind of explore why it takes the spiral shape, which actually helped it to overlay on the change grid. And then I think probably one of the last things we talked about last time around was the spiral dynamics model. If you look at it, seems to expand as you go up the spiral, kind of like the shape of a tornado. And because their description of the highest level matches our description for the center of the change grid. By the way, am I sharing my screen? Yeah. We said, well, maybe we should need to invert that and have it be that as the spiral advances, the world becomes simpler for people to understand or to sort through the complexity of what's going on in the world around them, to find the simple message that will ultimately unify everyone at the highest level of expression. And once we reach that point, we know that the center of the change grid is its own expansive universe, and a whole new understanding of the universe would come from that. That sounded awfully metaphysical, didn't it? But you guys get the point here. So that's rare. So I was left with the one big question, and that is how? How do you go about moving an individual, moving a company or a group or a society as a whole? How do you move people up and down this spiral? And a couple of you sent some interesting things over to me that I wanted to share with you. The first one, let's see. Yeah, Kathy, you're on the call. Kathy, I think you sent this over to me earlier today. So why don't you go ahead and mute
Yes.
yourself. Tell people
Frederick
what it is.
Laloux's work.
Yeah, tell us a little bit back.
Yeah, Frederick Laloux is an organization. He's focusing on organization design, which is a lot of what I've done with my work through my life, which is how do you create an organization based on its strategy and put the structures, systems, processes, culture, people in place to achieve that strategy. And so his work has become a bit of the bedrock now, particularly for European organization designers, and it's made more of a mark over the last 6 or 7 years in the United States. He wrote a book, and I think this is 2014, where he basically takes and he doesn't actually refer to spiral dynamics per se in the work, but he assumes it based on a lot of people who have done work based on the Claire Graves work that we talked about. And so what he has been doing is creating frameworks that take a look at, and I just sent T just a few pieces of this, of looking at organizations, starting way back with, red to, all the way up through orange, green, and teal, and saying how do we create organizations for the future which are allow us to really operate at a level of self-management and move away from the hierarchy power kinds of relationships we have in the past. And so many people, particularly mostly in Europe, and the Dutch are excellent at this, at creating organizations that are almost totally self-managed and work with policies and practices and cultures that have really moved away from hierarchy and really moved away from the kind of power dynamics we're used to, where there are the haves and the have-nots, and that people have the opportunity to contribute in a very whole way, in a balanced way, where they're using their whole selves and constantly, and also it's about creativity and innovation. So the extent to which this actually, he's taken it through up to teal, and there's pretty much a match with this altitudes of development model. And what you can see here is he's looked at culture, he's looked at HR practices, but one of what T is showing here is this notion of wholeness in an organization and in organizations. And so he's basically making comparisons from the orange practices, which are based on rationality and individualism and a degree of meritocracy, to green, which those of us who do organization development work, those of you on the call that do this, know that there's been much more of a focus on empowerment, in the last 20 years, and equality, et cetera, which is more of the green model, the globalization that we've all experienced. And now people have been moving into the complexity theory concepts, which underpin the teal organizations, which is, that notion of adaptability, flexibility, able to manage the volatility in the world, resilience, hierarchy as natural as opposed to man-made. And so all of that is happening, and he's created frameworks that address all aspects of organizations. Like I was saying, human resources, people practices, structures. There's some really interesting work that I've been playing with structures for a small nonprofit that are totally self-managing teams at the top, and using network organizations. And larger corporations have been using the concept of network organizations for quite some time as well, and borrowing pieces of this. And there is an organization called Bertzog out of the Netherlands that's doing some very interesting work with this, and concepts like holacracy and sociocracy and other concepts that have emerged in organization design over the last 15 years, that companies like Zappos have been using. Just a whole range of different concepts have emerged, and they reflect more of that teal focus. And a lot of it is based in this work that Lalou has been doing. So it's very interesting. And I basically sent I sent T chapter 2 of the book, which talks a little bit about that migration up from the lower levels and up into, that was my mistake.
Sorry, no worries.
It's been a struggle for me. My eyes are getting better, but it was a struggle.
Okay.
But basically, moving through these levels, and attaching real organizational practices to these. So it's definitely worth exploring. I mean, it's been since I read the book, but but all of it is here. And I just didn't make the immediate connection to when you were talking about spiral dynamics earlier to say, oh my God, this is what Lalou has been doing. So I wanted to share that with you.
Thank you. Well, and I thought it was really good because if you, and again, just so you guys know, we do have some static issues going on. So if you'll keep your lines muted, if you're not throwing anything in, that would really be good. But don't hesitate to unmute and chime in anytime you really want. But we said, like the last piece, Farah, how do you move somebody along the curve? And I was sharing that I had very little luck looking for how you move an individual from one level to the next to the next. And Kathy pointed out that Lalou's work is talking about what happens at the organizational level. And so I found this quite fascinating, because even in my own work as a consultant, and by the way, I've done extensive work in the Netherlands, and I'll share with you one little quick story. I remember the very first time I was in the Netherlands, and I went into the company that was, went into my client company, and I see this big sea of workspaces, no real individual offices. There's a few little offices with doors, but they're just, little conference rooms that anybody can use if they need a little bit of privacy or whatever. But I just said to someone, I said, okay, who's in charge? And their answer to me was, that depends. And I went like, well, there's an interesting answer. But you very quickly learned that their whole way of structuring things was that depending on the project or depending on a particular part of the project, that concept of who's in charge is very organic and is constantly in motion. And I said, so you guys don't have like a boss per se? And they said, well, we do have kind of like we have an organizational chain we follow if we want to request like days off, or if, you know, there's some issue going on and somebody has to make a tie-breaking decision, you know, that exists, but it's not the order of the day. I thought, how very fascinating, very fascinating. So anyway, learned a lot from observing that going on. And one of the things that I was reminded of as I looked at what Kathy sent me is that the Dutch believe that if you change the environment, the culture will follow. And one of the things that seems to be the way the US has been positioning things, I don't know who else to include in the category with the US, but is that somehow we're supposed to change the culture. And once the culture is changed, then the environment changes. And their thought was, no, no, no. When you put people into a totally different environment, they have no choice but to rearrange themselves in a way that works inside of the new environment. So any thoughts about that before I go on and talk specifically
Yeah,
about Kathy
see,
showed you?
this is Peter.
Yes.
I think that goes along with the lines in sociology, the fundamental attribution error, that
Mhm.
so much of our behavior is a function of our environment. And given a toxic environment, you know, a normal person could behave like a sociopath. And I think what you're saying, the opposite is true.
Mhm,
Mm,
mhm,
yeah. And I would just add to that, that organization designers have finally come around over the last 15 years or so to the idea that culture is an input to organization environment, but that environment really shapes culture. So how you shape the culture of an organization is by the structures and the policies and the practices that you put in place. And that's what creates the environment that enables a culture to flourish. So it's less mechanistic, it's more of that model, but it's taken people a while to put that into, or designers have been there for a long time, but it's very hard for companies to put that into practice.
mhm.
It's interesting. You know, I got to say, back in the 60s when I was on psych wards, we talked about milieu therapy, and it was that concept way back then. It was all about environment to change the the
Right. So
psychology of the
if you,
patient.
right,
Yeah.
right, right, right. Jane, you have your hand up. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like, or have I not unmuted you?
No,
Yeah,
you
there
did. I was just recently reading, and I can't remember exactly what book this was in, but they were talking about just that designing, and this was an organization that was building a new building, and so they built the stairwells to be. They wanted to get their people to walk more up the stairs and be more healthier. So they built these stairwells that were quite large, and on each landing or every other couple of landings, they had a really nice seating area. And these were on in the building was somewhere where they had these expansive views out of the windows of the stairwell. And so it completely changed the nature of, you know, what people would do. Rather than get on the elevator, which was right inside the doors, they would go and walk up the stairwell just to appreciate the view. And then it became a gathering, you know, these landings became gathering places where people would go take breaks and, you know, get together and stuff.
Well, I think it's a really interesting way to look at it. This client in the Netherlands had said that they had always been in an office space that everyone had a closed door. There were narrow corridors. There was really no space to gather other than some sort of like a formal meeting room or whatever. And then the company decided to build its own new office building, and they built this new office building with little, if any, private rooms. And suddenly all these people were thrown into an open sitting kind of an environment. And this is probably back back when cubicles first started coming on scene, but it encouraged people to interact a little bit more, almost that they had no choice. Well, now when you go into a lot of these modern sorts of companies, they've even eliminated the cubicle walls.
Right.
So, now you're just seeing like this sea of workspace with computer terminals, everywhere that you're all looking in. And I just kind of go like, I'm someone who I need silence in order to really think at my best. So I'd be the first one with the ear pods and just going, I need my door, I need my walls.
Well,
Tia,
now
yeah.
it's challenging because of COVID, and my partner is a commercial architect, and we've been talking quite a bit about that because recently all the office buildings last year were being built with this completely open space where you move desks around and stuff like that, and now they're finding that you can't work in an environment like that.
Right.
So I think it's going to be so interesting to see how COVID is going to influence the office spaces of the future.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'd love to comment on that, Jane, as well, because I worked a couple of years ago. I was working out on the West Coast with a big pharma who just decided to invest hundreds, millions of dollars, removing their cubicles or an organization, to promote teamwork and promote the open space. But it's for people who do design work and and also for human resources people who need the privacy of the space. And so it's like, are you correlating the task at hand
Yes.
with the kind of privacy that you actually need to get the work done? And so it's been such a trend of investment. And right after that was when COVID hit, so that people were complaining prior to that. And then when COVID hit, you're exactly what you're saying. It's suddenly not the best model, and it speaks to designing your structures to accommodate the work, as well as designing, your physical structures, as well as designing your work boundary.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah,
Well,
What is the title of the book?
Oh,
Oh.
go ahead, Kathy. What's the name of the book that this came from? Oh, Kathy.
I'm sorry, it's called Reinventing Organizations by
There we go.
Frederick Laloux.
Yeah, Laloux.
Frederick
Laloux.
Yeah, Laloux. Yeah.
Reinventing corporations. Yeah.
Reinventing Organizations. Yeah.
Now there was one other little chart, and then I'll get back to this one. Oh, yeah, Kathy, yeah, you got the echo. There you go. There's a lot of interesting things, but there's this one little chart here I want to show you before I kind of make my little comment about what we're looking at. Is this idea that these things have been unfolding over, thousands of years as we move through time, and now we're at this point of tremendous acceleration. I thought that was very interesting. That if we look at the lowest level, this beige kind of level, that goes back to primitive, dawning of humanity or whatever. So 250,000 years ago or more. And then, it took you 50,000 years to get to the next level, the spiral. Then it took you another, what's the math show? Another 35,000 years to get to the next one, and then another 10,000 years to get to the next one. And suddenly we are accelerating in a rather great speed, which is a good thing. But it also means that our role as consultants is something that has to be able to constantly change and evolve at an even, not so much at a faster rate, but we have to be ahead of the curve, because we need to know where it is that we're trying to help people move to. How can we know what that level of existence is, what those values are, unless we ourselves have already arrived there? Are you guys with me on this kind of process?
Absolutely.
Because I'll go ahead and say this, I certainly know plenty of people that are in the field of human development that are, that are probably as orange as orange can be. Yeah, orange as orange can be, and have little, if any, interest in ever advancing beyond that. And so they become like a bit of an orange anchor. And as they go out marketing their services, they're probably going to be more readily accepted by prospective customers that are also in the orange level and for whatever reason wish to remain in the orange level. Because change requires what do I say? I don't want to say a sacrifice of control, but a change in the control equation. And we've talked about this countless times from your earliest training in ChangeWorks. People aren't willing to lose control. And so they'll only even put their control equation into discussion if they believe that they are likely to lose control one way or another if they stay where they're at, or they see that the gain in control they may achieve offers such great promise of opportunity growth, whatever it is they really want, that they go like, okay, fine, I'll get rid of my comfy situation and I'll become uncomfortable for a while in order to advance this whole sort of thing. And so I think too, we have to be aware in our own value system and in our own way of operating our businesses and the kinds of products, programs, and services that we offer. Are we an anchor to a particular level of evolution, or are we a, what do I say, a beacon? I know that's kind of loftier than I was going for, but that's where it came to me. A beacon of how things could be. And we're looking for those companies, those opportunities that also know that it's time to leave the level that they're at. So I'll shut up now. What did that trigger in you guys? So anyone have any thoughts about what I've just said about consultants being anchors for where they are, and that reinforces the anchoring of those kinds of enterprises?
Well,
Yes,
this
go
is,
ahead.
oh,
Go ahead,
yeah,
Peter.
this is,
Yeah,
okay, yeah. Well, I think
I-
it gives a mandate for each of us to do our work, you know. For me, yoga, meditation, and also being exposed to Kenneth Wilber and these concepts are so powerful. And I think it's, you know, we have a mandate to do our work. And it reminds me of Carl Jung's quote. He was asked if there's hope for the world, and he said there is if enough of us do our work. And I think what you're saying is that as we do it, we're able to get more and more of a critical mass.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, I resonate fully.
Excellent. Good, good, good.
Yeah, I
Okay,
have a
David,
question.
Brian, go
Yeah.
ahead, David.
Are we placing a value judgment on these levels?
Never. They were all vital in the evolution of who we are. They were all important in how we got to where we are.
Well, it sounds like we're placing a value judgment if we're saying that green's better than orange and teal is better than green and turquoise is better than teal.
Well, then we have to be careful with the words that we choose. And that's certainly, I think, something we always have to be kind of aware of. It's not so much that we're saying that anything that came before us is bad. I think that what we're saying is that as we continue to evolve, we're evolving because the natural order of evolution is to take us to a higher state that in the long run will be, I don't know what other word to use, but better for humanity, better for existence, better for whatever. So
If I can speak to that for a minute from an organizational perspective, from an environmental perspective, organizations basically design has been forced almost to move into these categories by the environment, because what has been happening is the increase of change entered with globalization and the rate of change that has been happening over the last 40 years, 50 years. And you know that consultants have been talking about this forever, but with that VUCA kind of mentality, with the rate of change happening with globalization, with social media, with the internet, with our technology, that things are happening so quickly that organizations can't afford to be in the green or the orange levels anymore because they don't move quickly enough. And the teal level is evolving, not because there's a value judgment attached to it, but because they are more agile and enable people to make decisions more quickly and do the work more quickly. And that's why that has been evolving, and why people who do organizational work have had to discard. I mean, I've been discarding models for years now, as things move forward. Discard models and move with, in order to enable agility in this world.
Yeah, and for me, I didn't see it as any one of these are necessarily better than than another. But I just think about all the places I lived around the world, and now being in the United States. For me, this represents like an adaptability, and that's a skill in and of itself. So it's like it's impossible to grow and resist at the same time. So each one of these levels will serve its purpose for its time, but as it is with any system, the system can only be as great as it is creating the results that you're trying to attain. So if it no longer does that, then you have to change an element, a property within a system, or you change the system itself.
Yep.
And I think about this from the perspective of, like, in medical school, there's this idea of structure function integration. And this idea that how you structure any structures, you can tell the functionality of it. So when and they kind of impact one another, right? So like a structure built in Florida is built for hurricanes, which is a uniquely different structure than a home built in California where you built for earthquakes. Two different structures, two different functionalities and purpose. And that's how I see this model here. So this idea of evolving requires one to examine in real time, like, hey, this system served us up to this point, but what do we need to let go of, and how can we grow from here?
And behind all that is a very big assumption, and that is that the person wants to change. And this is what we talked about last time around. I think it was Graves was saying these different steps that someone goes through as they work their way up the next level of the spiral. The number one is there has to be some sort of capacity for the growth to occur. And part of that capacity was a willingness to change. And so I'll give you guys an example of this. You remember, any of you have been around long enough to remember business before there was the internet, before there was even AOL? Well, pardon me, sorry. Trying to talk and swallow simultaneously. So we had a client who was a travel agency, and the owner of this travel agency was most definitely a stick in the mud in many ways. But here they were talking about how they wanted to start adding some things so that people could find them if they were online or whatever. So, and I remember this guy said, I don't use the internet. And it's like the first thing that came out of my mouth was that your internet usage is meaningless. The question is, what do your customers want? And I remember the conversation became very adversarial between all of his team members and him, because they kept saying to him, you only have one choice in this matter, and that is adapt or die. So adapt or die is the universal ultimatum, and humans are no exception. That comes right out of the survival instincts. Training we talked about on another call. Adapt or die is the universal ultimatum. Well, you guys know what happened to the travel agent industry. Those that were unwilling to adapt are gone. So what did travel agents even do? Forget COVID. What did they do even before COVID? What was left for them to do? We all make our own flight arrangements. We all make our own hotel reservations. We don't need them anymore. And so I think that's also part of it. Anyone who is operating an organization of any sort at one of these levels and chooses to stay at that level may very well find themselves in a situation where they become irrelevant, undesirable, and ultimately are going to suffer from their own, what I want to say, their own inflexibility. Yep, right. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Lack of adaptability.
Lack of adaptability. So it's like, why are we hanging on to something for so long after plenty of evolution has occurred with new ideas, new ways of doing things? You with me, Code? So Uh,
You know what, T, what this reminds me of is the, there's an award for the best place that people love to work, the best places that people love to work. And very successful businesses are always on that list, but they're trying to change and adapt to what people are wanting now out of work to build their businesses. So that kind of parallels for me with the discussion.
Yeah, well, and it's affecting everything. What you're saying about the best places to work goes back to David's work. So David does a lot of work with recruiting and hiring. Well, the company, the client needs people. Well, they have to get those people out of the pool of candidates that exists. And if the values of that pool of candidates is changing, what those candidates might be looking for might not be provided by a company that is at a particular level. So David, do you encounter that or talk about that in your work?
Well, I do, and I was listening to the discussion earlier about velocity, and the challenge that I see with this is that, and I can, you know, kind of point to our country at the moment, there are people trying to force evolution.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who haven't bought into it yet.
Yep.
And so there is no velocity.
So let me ask this. Do you think that's a product in part of this? I keep hearing about in the workspace how it's shaped by this industrial revolution. And now you have these knowledge workers, and that's a whole different environment that's needed for people to really feel value. Because like what Linda was talking about with the best place to work, I think that Best Place to Work Institute, #1 typically on their list, and they've been doing that for 40 plus years. Often the top 5 is people want to feel valued as an employee first, as a human being first, not an employee. That's a whole different value than just showing up, going to work, putting up with policies and procedures and not getting any juice out of it in terms of purpose and meaning.
Brian, it might be, but you have to look at the leaders, and this is what I do in my coaching work, and see how it is that they're rewarded and compensated.
Gotcha.
And I'm telling you that this ambition for indigo has nothing to do with how we compensate people in this country.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're a long way from indigo.
Well, I think we're a long way from green.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's it right now. The battle right now, I believe, is between orange and green. Yeah, orange to green. And then teal is starting to peek in a little bit. As Kathy said, you do find a lot more teal thinking in some European countries that, you know, we've personally experienced. So there is that going on. But you're right, that's where we're at. We're not up to turquoise. We're not up to.
Their stock prices are good and their year-end earnings are good. I would say it's fine to aspire to a higher level, but all I'm telling you is that those are the metrics with which society measures success.
Right. Well, yeah. And so let's just kind of look at this chart over here on the right a little bit. That's the issue, is that the speed of acceleration, the velocity, as you said, is increasing. And so the ability to let go is one I'm going to say challenge that has to be overcome. And the other challenge that I don't think it's talked about enough is that when too big of a change occurs too quickly, then the devil is in the details. And then there ends up being a lot of false starts, a lot of confusion, because it's just too big of a change happening too quickly. And so,
and the one that shines brightest now is energy. You know, the pandemic is going to pass us. Energy is never going to pass us. And this movement seems to forget that there needs to be stepwise progress to advancement, not a leap of faith.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And so I think that that's part of the issue, though, is now because these levels are so tight together, I think there's probably a level of conflict between levels that may not have occurred earlier. As you know, face it, when the magenta people came along and there were still people in infrared, these are 10, what was it, 50,000 years apart. And then you go to the next one, which would have been, I don't know, what was after magenta?
2,000 years.
Yeah, the red. I mean, come on. We're talking about people that inside, you look at these spans. This is a span of, how do I put this? Inside of our lifetime now, it is possible that we're going to go through multiple spiral evolutions inside of a single lifetime, instead of generations upon generations upon generations. And so more than anything, I think what we're being called upon to do is to appreciate where we were, acknowledge where we are, and aspire to where we really want to be. But we have to do all three of those things at once.
Agreed.
Yeah, and so that's what it's really all about. So there's always going to be, anytime a change is occurring, there's going to be people who want to hold on to the current way of doing things because it has served people well. There's always going to be early adapters. There's always going to be late adapters. Someone's got to be at the leading edge of the whole thing. So when you've got these people all existing and expressing themselves simultaneously, you're going to end up with conflict. Now, here's the thing that we know for certain. Societies do not evolve, or rather devolve, going down the hierarchy. That's the belief. I don't believe that's true. I think it's very possible for a society to end up tumbling down this spiral. And maybe I think that way only because I happen to be a fan of science fiction. And so how many different stories, movies, whatever, have you seen about a post-apocalyptic society? Right?
Too many.
Mhm.
Too many of them. Well, they're saying like, look,
Post-apocalyptic now.
and so if you just go like, wait a second, the day that anybody decides to trigger a global nuclear war, the vast majority of the planet is going to be dramatically impacted. Life, the loss of life will be immeasurable. Technologies will come to a screeching halt. We're going to go tumbling down this spiral, and fast. We may very easily find ourselves all the way down to beige in the early days, while we try to just figure out how do we survive in that kind of a thing. So the belief that we will never move down spiral is nonsense. But the thought that we are going to devolve slowly down it, no. Assuming nothing catastrophic or profoundly stupid occurs, sooner or later we're going to continue to move up this spiral. And I think that's why the question has to be asked and answered. Where are you positioning yourself as a human development professional along that spiral work? So are you going to be someone who says, I meet my clients exactly where they are, and I help them to stay exactly where they are because it's their choice? Or are you someone who says, well, I'll meet them where they are, but I know, and that even sounds too arrogant to even adopt as a philosophy, but I know where they should go, or they need to go, or I see a better place. So who do we allow to drive the bus, us or the client? What do you guys?
Well, if I could say something here, the memes develop or evolve or unfold to meet the complexity of the environment. So as complexity increases in the environment, which it is doing, and it's doing so at a more and more accelerated pace, it's sort of change or die. And not in every organization or not in every industry, but in a lot of industries, and we see this in healthcare where they can stay. You meet them in in the orange or the orange blue kind of thing, and moving up into green. But if they don't start to evolve and move, they're just going to be caught flat-footed and are not going to be able to survive in meeting the complexity. And you can awaken. I mean, if you look at QAnon, that's awakening the red tendencies in people, because it's fear-based and tribal, very much tribal, impulsive.
Well, I think there are a number of those in the society.
There
right
are. Oh
now.
yeah. Yeah. And there's
Yeah.
more that we don't know about than the ones that we do know about.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can easily you can awaken those or reinforce those memes
Mhm.
in people.
Jane, have you introduced this to the healthcare space at all?
Oh, no, I wanted to include, when I was writing my master's thesis, I wanted to include this because we were studying spiral dynamics right at the end when I was in graduate school. And my mentor said, no, you cannot put another model in your thesis. Because I'm just like, I just love thinking about complexity in this kind
And
of
you
stuff.
live in power, don't you?
Right. Gather
I don't
information,
know, I'm just
share it,
like
integrate it.
so curious about all of this stuff. But a couple of years ago, I found an organization called Cognidev, which is out of South Africa, and they have some really interesting assessments. And they have a values orientation assessment, which I just opened mine up this morning. I've actually paid for the certification and I haven't done it yet, but it's based on spiral dynamics. And I'm happy to share my one that I took if anybody's interested. But I just like, I'm really curious about this. And so when I was looking at that, to answer your question, Brian, when I was looking at that this morning, I was like, man, I got to I got to pull this thing back out and get certified. And,
Yeah,
because I think it is so applicable.
absolutely. I was
Yeah.
thinking about what David said, and as you know, Jane, the healthcare space tend to respond in a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And other than that, they're really not. They're really slow to change, and so I think this would be excellent for the healthcare space.
Yeah, it's so funny. We have this one client that when something happens, some crisis happens for them, their executive team just rallies and can create miracle and adapt to whatever it is. And I have tried so hard to get them to think of, okay, how can we bring that kind of approach to the everyday mundane
Right.
of things that you need to shift an organization into value-based healthcare. So I was trying to get them to adopt the miracleize the mundane. Like, how can you bring that mindset to implementing these changes that seem like they're mundane, but really they're just essential and key to adapting to what's required, in the future. So
I can comment here. The Bertzog in the Netherlands is a healthcare organization.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, some of these organizations are healthcare organizations that are using these concepts of self-management and trying to operate in the teal space. So there's, that's why I'd recommend you sort of taking a look at this, because healthcare is definitely in certain environments moving in that direction. Our healthcare system is so complicated and unbelievably, as you all know, incredibly complicated, that it's a lot harder to make that kind of change. But it's happening in Europe, and it's worth taking a look at. It's BUURTZORG, Bertzog, that they are doing some interesting things that way.
Well, I think there are probably some entrepreneurial endeavors that are happening. Even the companies that are the telehealth, companies that are starting up. There are pockets of healthcare that are happening, that are innovating.
Yes.
And that's why these systems that are anchored with a lot of capital investment, like hospitals and stuff like that, which are just going to become irrelevant in the future as more and more ambulatory services, take over. They're going to be caught flat-footed if they are not involved with,
Yeah.
you know, if they're not looking at, if they're not exploring
I mean,
possible.
if anything, I mean, I'm thinking, I don't know what you guys think. I know this is just off tangent and I will stop talking about it. I think that that direction, that push is what's going to force the changes in our healthcare system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm looking at now. In
Well, they
terms
get pulled. It's not a push, it's a pull, because it's like
pull.
if they don't,
Yeah.
you know, if they don't step up, they're
Mhm.
gonna be assimilated or, you know, merged or bought out or whatever.
Yep.
You know,
Yes.
I do a lot of assessment, obviously, with the hiring process and everything else. And I think this would be an interesting assessment exercise because I think we could all agree that whatever level an organization is at is reflective of its leadership.
Mhm, mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's interesting to do some kind of assessment on the entire leadership and see the different levels that people are really at.
Mhm. And those do exist. I did find like a parlor game version of that you can do online for free. It asks you just a relative handful of questions, but it tells you where you are. And one of the things that comes out of it is that um, it is unusual for someone to be 100% any one of these levels.
Right.
That there are different aspects of your life that you may be in a very different place. So, for example, they were saying if you are involved in a competitive sport, when you are playing that competitive sport, you are very much doing a red activity. So, you know, aggressive, impulsive, ruthless, courageous, you know, pardon me. Where if you go to church on Sunday, well, that's more of an amber kind of an activity. So if you're volunteering and all that sort of thing, well, maybe that's someplace else. And so it's interesting to just see what your kind of color balance looks like. Um, and I think that's particularly interesting when we finally get to the real subject of how do we go about helping an individual move from one to another. So, for example, I don't mind saying to you guys that um, if I'm watching a sport, so let it be soccer, whatever the sport happens to be, and suddenly the philosophy governing this sport became a teal kind of a philosophy, wouldn't that be a very boring game to watch?
Mm.
You
Yeah.
know? I mean, if you think about it, a lot of sports today, like, you know, football is the equivalent of gladiators from way back when. And, you know,
Right.
so it's like we have to kind of go, well, for certain things that we all do, there's an appreciation for different levels that come into that play. Yeah.
If I can comment here as well, I don't know if I'm sure some of you are familiar with Keegan's work.
Mhm. Yeah.
And he's done immunity to change and done, you know, his analysis on people operating at different levels of, it's not quite consciousness, but it's psychological development. And that is the psychological model that I think comes closest. Immunity to change comes closest to working with this, although it doesn't refer to these colors and it isn't talking about, you know, broad-based societal change, but it is a parallel model. I don't know if any of you would agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Oh, another person who doesn't talk about spiral dynamics specifically, but she writes a lot about change, and she has a really good book called Changing on the Job, which is her name is Jennifer Garvey Berger, and hers is about human, you know, developmental stages and how one does need to evolve or grow developmentally to meet the needs, because she and her organization, they're also out of South Africa, I think, or
Yeah.
New Zealand maybe.
She's
But
fantastic.
yeah, they talk about oh, just completely lost. Oh, complexity. So
Yeah.
they deal a lot in the Cynefin framework, and you know, how do you work in complexity, or how can you lead effectively in a complex environment? So she has a couple of really good books, but Changing on the Job kind of speaks to um, coaching, developmental coaching, and helping people.
I use her work too, and she also bases a lot of her stuff on Keegan's work as well. but yeah, but she uses complexity theory. She's really great.
Yep. Okay, so this, I'm glad you guys are finding this subject matter to be kind of interesting on multiple levels. I always feel like I need to pull things back to this whole change grid. I don't know why, but sooner or later we have to go like, all right, how do we make this all practical? How do we translate all of this understanding into something that can be done at the individual level inside of a relationship with them that's going to be measured in, you know, perhaps years if you're lucky, but you know what I mean? I got to find a way to make all this work at the individual kind of level. Now, certainly we could do a group profile and we could say, yeah, well, we can take it up a level and say, what can we do at the group level? But how do you go about helping an individual move up and down their own spiral? And I'm going to give you guys a scenario that I think you'll be able to use as kind of like a framework to describe this. So how many of you have ever worked with an executive, and that executive, for whatever reason, happens to be at one of these more fire kinds of levels, whether it's red, orange, whatever. They're basically here where it's about tight levels of hierarchical control. Everything is driven entirely by the bottom line, on and on and on. So, and
I've
then,
got one of those right now, T.
yeah. And so, and how many of them are now finding that they are struggling to relate to either the marketplace, relate to certain parts of the society they have to deal with, or the employees that they're suddenly finding like, wait a second, these people aren't cooperating with my mandates.
Well, that's an exact expression of what I face right now with a client.
Mhm.
He's I've been working with him for 26 years. He was a controller at a manufacturing organization when I first met him, and now he's president of an insurance agency. But he's a CPA. And I want you to know, every spreadsheet, every number to explain every detail is there, and there's just and we did a cultural survey 2 years ago, and we were starting to look at heading in a more positive direction. Then the pandemic hit, so now it's right back to ground zero. It's all about the numbers. It's all about do what I say. You didn't do what I say. And reward and punishment.
Yeah. Yep. And so that to me is where our real work is, because as much as I've got my opinions, my thoughts, my opinions, my beliefs about what's going to happen at the societal level, at the cultural, at the civilization sort of a level, that's not what we all actually do. So what we all actually do is work with individuals, small groups perhaps, and try to help them to change as effectively as they can, and achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve. We got to get this down to the practical kind of level. And so what is it that you would say to an individual who is, as David has just described, to say, well, I get it, completely get it. And by the way, it served you well for 300 years. But in this past X amount of time, things have started to evolve. And now there's different expectations being placed on you as a business and as a business leader, and you have a choice. Do you want to be an early adopter, a middle adopter, a late adopter, or a never adopter? How you position yourself in those choices is going to greatly influence what kind of work we're going to. Because if you say, I'm never going to adopt because I'm only going to be working for another 10 years, okay, fine, you pay me for my time, I'll help you to cope with whatever that is. But if you go like, no, this is a generational business, we got to make sure it's sticking with the times, well, that's going to change what we might want to be looking at and working on. And so how do you do that? What's the how part
And
of how
the
we
most
work with individuals?
fascinating elements are usually contained in a family-owned business.
Yeah, I think one way to get people to move is that question, well, how's that working for you?
Yeah.
Because they'll, eventually they will begin, well, it's not guaranteed, but if they can really think into that, they'll begin to recognize, or, you know, hopefully have insights that maybe something's got to change.
Yeah,
Well,
Dave,
and
I have a real quick story. I had a law firm that I was dealing with, and they were Theory X out of the Ming Dynasty, very male dominated and all of that. And I just did a simple survey monkey survey of 2 questions or 4 questions. You know, what do you need to do to be more successful, and what's preventing you from being successful? What does the firm need to do to be more successful, and what's preventing the firm from being more successful? And I gave the raw data from that survey, from their 100 employees, to the 2 managing partners. And after about 15 minutes of disbelief and looking at the information, they finally turned to me and said, well, what do we do?
Yep. So it's that creating awareness, and now we're getting into the skill set. So
Yeah.
David found a creative way. Remember, we have to let them know, if we go back to what we talked about last time around, that while the current system, whatever color you're at, has served you well for a good long while, it has always had, or it is starting to have, or it's going to have a certain set of problems. And we need to find a way to deal with whatever the issues are of that layer. Well, one of the first things they have to do is become aware of it. Remember, we said people move from being an unconscious incompetent to being a conscious incompetent. So one of the things we need to do as human development professionals is to first help that person become aware of something. And so David did that by putting together a sweet little survey. So took you how long, David? 20 minutes to set the thing up?
Oh, 20 minutes to set the whole thing up, 10 minutes to read the results. And you know what I did was, I mean, I gave them the raw data. I didn't even categorize it. I just gave them the raw data and let them read down through every response.
Yep.
And 85 to 90% of the responses were negative.
Yep.
And blamed the firm for their inability to succeed at a higher level.
Yep.
And they literally had no idea that those sentiments existed within their firm.
That's right.
That's brilliant.
And that fast, the unconscious incompetent became a very conscious incompetent.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, that's a pattern interrupt. I love that. That's
right.
brilliant.
A gross pattern interrupt. And I think that that's really what we need to say, because the alternative is we try to talk people into understanding something. And we could be having a one-on-one discussion with the client for, you decide how much time, and go nowhere in changing their belief system around their reality. So David, I mean, am I right? Before you decided to do this little survey monkey, was there dialogue that happened? You just kind of went like, well, this is going nowhere. So.
Well, you know, the problem is, and I related back to spiral dynamics, you can't pass from one level to another until, number 1, you're aware, and number 2, you see it's a problem.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so this is why I'm going, like, you know, when I'm saying, like, I want all of us to come back to a practical set of skills, a practical approach for helping an individual, a small group or whatever, move around the spiral. That's our scope of impact. We're not going to have an impact, you know, how do I do that? We would have to have a very different job if we wanted to have an impact at a city level, a state level, or whatever than we have. Now, could we write a book? Yeah. Could we, you know, do something? We could do a few things, but what we can all do is something at that individual and small group kind of level. So first thing we have to be able to do is to create a level of consciousness, a level of awareness. How do we go about doing that? Now we can come up with a lot of creative sorts of ways of doing that.
Yeah, I should have probably used the ChangeGrid.
Well, no, but what I like, where these things fit in, is I like the idea that you did a survey monkey kind of a thing, because it confronted them with it. Well,
Mhm.
now they come up with a question, well, so David, what are we going to do? Now I think it's time to pull out a change grid and say, well, we need to do the following things, and then let that become the activity list. When they fill out the activities, you'll be able to say, so these people are going to be resistant to it. These people are on board with it. These people are lacking in the skills necessary. These people, whatever. The change grid will tell them how ready their group is to do what needs to be done, how engaged they are in doing the work, how likely they are to follow through and do that. And the last one is what type and level of support they're going to need. So remember, the change grid answers those 4 questions. And so I think you're at the point now where it's a great time, pardon me, to use the change grid. So, yeah.
I also think something as simple as a SWOT analysis,
Oh,
can
yeah.
be,
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same concept of just understanding where you are, but in an individual level, yeah, we do those small surveys in a small
Well,
organization.
and I think what we're just saying is that every profession has a tool or should have a tool that will confront someone with their reality in a very quick and convincing sort of a way. David used a survey kind of a survey monkey kind of a thing. You know, you go to the doctor, they take an x-ray, you can see that there's a fracture. Okay. All right, I guess I've got a broken leg. What am I going to do? You know? So what is our tool that allows us to do that? And luckily, when it comes to the awareness sort of a thing, aspect of the work that needs to be done, we got a lot of options available to us. And so we're at the top of the hour now. So let me just say that on Tuesday, we'll continue this, focusing more on practical application. Although I don't mind things meandering, you know, we only have one rule in the world of tension management. What's the only rule we have?
Pay attention to tension.
Pay attention to tension. And so if people want to talk about whatever, I'm happy to talk about it. But, you know, we do have kind of like an agenda in the background somewhere. And that agenda is, how do we get this to actual practical approach and skills for working with individuals?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. But I'm curious to know, for you guys to all just think about the work that you've done in all the years leading up to today. How have you gone about creating awareness in a way that people can accept it and embrace it? You know, there's lots of ways to create awareness that will result in them killing the messenger.
Yeah,
That's not helping us, right? So
well, it's happened to me numerous times.
exactly right, exactly, because we see it and we're blunt and whatever the case may be. So it's got to be a way of creating awareness that actually draws the person closer to us, or somehow or another edifies us in their eyes, so that it's got to be, it has to strengthen that, because once they trust us with their fears, the acknowledgement that they are consciously incompetent, we need to have that level of trust to be able to do the work that needs to be done. So we can't just slap somebody up the side of the head and expect that that's going to happen. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we'll continue on Tuesday. So thanks everybody so very, very much. Have yourself a lovely weekend. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.